Clear prop.
Star 738, Yankee number 2, following twin traffic, 3 mile final, clear subject. 1 Charlie Bravo, exit in runway 25, going 4 mile final.
This is Behind the Prop with United Flight Systems owner and licensed pilot Bobby Doss and his co-host, Major Airline Captain and Designated Pilot Examiner Wally Mulhern. Now let's go Behind the Prop.
What's up, Wally?
Hey, Bobby, how are you?
I am fantastic as always. This week, we're going to help everybody settle in after Thanksgiving. This is going to be a show we're calling Thanksgiving Leftovers. Hopefully, by the time you're listening to this, you've got through your leftovers and your rolly-over sandwiches and everything that was left over from the turkey, and you're enjoying your holiday time with your families. But this is a time to reflect a little bit on some training and some things that Wally and I have been talking about over the last few weeks preparing for this show. So, again, calling it Thanksgiving Leftovers. And I think it's all about, most of this is instrument type stuff, but if you're not an instrument rated pilot yet, you'll earn some knowledge from this show for sure. And I think we want to start talking about the things that maybe we're teaching and learning, but we've really only read about those things. Is that a good way to categorize those?
Yeah, it is. I think, we're sort of in a transition phase in aviation. We're going from low-tech navigation to high-tech GPS, and most of the airplanes that we fly are equipped with GPS, and let's be honest, that's really what we use most of the time. Back in the day, when I learned to fly, I mean, VOR was kind of like the high-tech. That was the fancy thing, and ADF and NDB was the low-tech, the stuff that we wanted to try to avoid. Now we've progressed, and what we're seeing is even the CFIs today, and again, it's not their fault, but even the CFIs today have never seen some of these things that we're talking about. They've never seen a ADF in an airplane. They're not really sure how it works, and they're trying to teach a little bit to their students, but they don't have any practical application to it. So we're just going to talk a little bit about this. We're not going to be an expert on flying NDB approaches when we get done here, but just talk about some things that, and a lot of what we're going to talk about may just really be trivial. It'd be kind of a did you know type thing.
But a lot of approaches, and I just happen to know you just came back from doing a check ride, and there was an ILS approach that we often fly in this area, coming out of this airport, and it says ADF required, right? And so if it says ADF required, and all these young men and women that are flying don't even know they probably don't even know if they have ADF in the plane, how do they respond to you when they're flying with you?
Right. Well, I do ask that question a lot, and the ILS 14 to Conroe, Texas, if you want to take a look at it, if you look at the top left-hand corner of the approach plate, it says ADF required. And
none of my planes have ADF.
No. You got 18 airplanes, right? And 0 of them have an ADF. Well, let's talk about what an ADF is and what it does. First of all, what does ADF stand for? ADF stands for Automatic Direction Finder. And that's not really a very good description of what it is. To me, Automatic Direction Finder, that would be a compass. Okay, if I've got a compass on my iPhone, that's an automatic direction finder. I pull it out and it tells me which way is north. That's a direction finder. But it's not an ADF in the sense of what we use it for in an airplane. So what does an ADF do? An ADF is a separate radio installed in an airplane that, again, most airplanes today don't have them. And I venture to say that most of them that have them, a very good portion of those probably don't work. An ADF points to a medium frequency beacon on the ground. And that beacon on the ground is called an NDB, which stands for non-directional beacon. So an ADF will point to that beacon, and that's simply all it does. There's no fancy OBS or anything like that on a VOR or an ILS. It's just a needle that points to the station. Now, here's a little bit of trivia. What an ADF will also point to is it's on the same frequency as AM radio stations. So an ADF will point to an AM radio station. And back in the day, we'd listen to the radio in the airplanes. We'd listen to AM stations over the ADF. I can remember in another career listening to the Astros in the National League Championship Series against the Mets in 1986. And we needed to descend to get into where we were going, and we were losing the radio station because we were listening to a Houston radio station.
So you're talking like the same way I would identify the Morse code today by listening to the nav radio. You were actually listening to a radio station.
Yeah, you're listening to the broadcast.
Awesome.
You're listening to the broadcast. And that is why it's an FCC requirement, why radio stations identify themselves, every so often, and I don't know what it is. I know for sure on the top of the hour and the bottom of the hour, but it may be more than that. The FCC requirement, at least at one point, was that they had to say, AM 790 KXYZ, Houston, Texas. And that was because airplanes could possibly navigate off these and find their way back home. It sounds so antiquated, but this was not that long ago. This is back in the 80s, maybe the 90s. But we would listen to AM radio stations using this technology. Now, it's very long range. We used to fly 727s across the Gulf of Mexico to Cancun, and that's how we would navigate. We would navigate using an ADF. Now, another problem with an ADF is if there was a storm out there and there was lightning, as soon as the lightning did its thing, the needle would point to the lightning. So you could be going straight toward your station, and if a lightning went off over to your left, boy, that needle pointed straight to the lightning for a little while, and then back on course.
So those sound like pretty good navigational aids, though. Why did we do away with those ADFs and NDBs?
Well, I think a lot of it is the maintenance. They are ground-based, so they need to be maintained. They need to go out there and fix them, make sure they're working, make sure they're operational. Now with satellite-based navigation, GPS, there are so many satellites. So on a given day, certain number of satellites could be out of commission, and you're still able to navigate. So I think it's a cost thing. Also, it's a range thing. You need to be have to be line of sight. So we say line of sight. Technically, you're not going to see it 100 miles off, but as long as there's nothing blocking you and that radio station, you should be able to pick it up.
Well, as I'm thinking about it out loud to myself here, I'm thinking, okay, I guess a VOR is much better because I actually have a radial, and as long as I stay on that radial, it doesn't matter how my plane's crabbed. If I'm tracking 2 on that radial, I know I'm still going to go right over top of that thing. I guess an ADF would not be the same if there was a wind. Yeah,
and a no-wind situation, ADF navigation or NDB navigation was actually pretty simple, but then you add wind into the equation, and it gets a little confusing because you don't want the needle straight off your nose if you're crabbing. The needle might be 10 degrees off your nose. If you're crabbing to the left, the needle would be to the right. And again, I don't want to get into too much of this, but going back to that original point of the approach in the Conroe, Texas, where it says ADF required, the reason is if you look at the approach plate, the final approach prefix is called alibi, and it is identified by an NDB. Again, the NDB is the thing that's located out on the ground, and the ADF is actually the radio that's in the airplane. So a lot of time we use these terms interchangeable. For instance, the approaches are called NDB approaches, but a lot of people will call them ADF approaches, and it's the same thing. We're talking the same thing. But this does say that an ADF is required. So how do we fly this approach? And what I'll get from a lot of people is, well, we must have an ADF because we fly this approach all the time. I'll say, okay, well, show me the ADF. Well, no, we don't have one. Well, okay. Well, there's an advisory circular from the FAA. I think it's AC 90-108, I believe. Don't quote me on that. But basically it says that a appropriately capable GPS can substitute for things like an ADF or DME or a VOR for that matter. So, you won't find it in the regulations anywhere, I don't believe, but you will find it in this advisory circular. So the bottom line is that we need to be able to navigate to that navigation fix, which is called alibi, and in the case of this. Now, I guess my frustration is why on the approach plate itself, instead of just saying ADF required, why can't it say ADF or GPS required? And that, I think, would alleviate so much of the confusion. And I mean, all we're doing is adding a couple of words, but that's not what it says. So,
but the net of it is the GPS gives us the ability to position the plane over the initial or the final approach fix in this case, which is the outer beacon.
Right. That's
which
correct.
is also an NDB, or there's an NDB on the ground at the same spot.
That's
that
correct.
gives you the ability to shoot the approach the same way.
That's correct.
With that. Okay.
That's correct. So again, if I would guess, I would say less than 5% of the airplanes out there have operable ADFs in them.
Yeah, I bet they're all marked in up probably in most cases.
I'm trying to think of the last time I flew in an air. Well, our 777s have them, but I'm trying to think of a general aviation airplane that had one that worked, or even had one for that matter. And I can't think of one.
Seems like a good tool now that I understand it better, but honestly, I don't think I've ever flown a plane with an operable ADF. I've only been flying for 8 years, so never even seen one, never shot an NDB approach of any sort. And it kind of missed the fact that I didn't get that opportunity when I was learning how to fly.
Yeah. Now the other thing that we see sometimes is DME. Now what is DME? DME stands for Distance Measuring Equipment. So one could make the case that a ruler is a DME. Okay, you can measure distance with a ruler. It's equipment, and you can measure distance with it. So using that definition, a ruler is DME. But that's not really the case. DME, from the FAA standpoint, a DME is an actual radio in the airplane, and it's the purpose of it is to measure your distance from a VOR. Now, how does it work? Now, a DME, and again, this is kind of trivia type stuff. A DME, you can tune a frequency to it. So if you're tracking to a VOR that happens to be 117.4, you would put 117.4 in your DME, and it would tell you how far you are away from the DME, from the VOR. Excuse me. Now, a DME measures slant range. What does that mean? Well, it means the actual distance from you in the airplane to the actual VOR station, which is located out in the field somewhere.
And I remember this because I did have a DME, and I used the DME a lot. We've talked about it. These planes didn't have GPSs when I was a student here, so most of them had DME units in them, and you would tune the DME to the localizer here as well, so you would know how far away you were from here. Because there was no ForeFlight in those days either.
Yeah.
So how did I know when to call in from 10 miles? Well, my instructor taught me it's probably more like 12 because we're a mile in the air and it's at the end of the runway that we're not going to.
Right.
So that's a mile-long runway and a mile in the air. We'd be 12 miles from that ground-based unit, radio timing.
Right.
And I would need to call from at least 12 miles out.
Right.
So when I saw 12 on the DME, I would say 10 from the west because of slant range, what you're talking about.
So, so the point is, if we're at 6,000 feet and we are right on top of the VOR, that DME is going to say you're 1 mile.
Yeah.
And, you call it an error. It's not an error because it's working exactly right. But that error is going to be more pronounced the closer you are. I mean, if you're 80 miles out, the difference in 80 and 81 probably isn't that big of a deal. But anyway, it is slant range. And so, we use DME. A lot of times the controllers say, what's your DME from such and such a VOR? And you look over at your GPS and you give him the distance. And that's probably what he's looking for. What he says technically. I mean, I guess you could say, I'm sorry, I do not have DME. But so how do we, so for instance, one question I like to ask applicants is what equipment we actually need to fly an approach. Well, from a very simple standpoint, if you look at the name of the approach, that probably tells you a whole lot. For instance, you're driving down the road and you're driving through a strange town and you're hungry. It's about lunchtime and you want to get something to eat. And you see a place and the sign says Johnny's Pizza. Well, chances are that they sell pizza at Johnny's Pizza. And if across the street, if there's Bill's Taco Shop, they probably sell tacos at Bill's Taco Shop. So at a very elementary level, start with the name of the approach. A VOR approach probably is flyable with nothing more than one VOR. Now, if the approach says VOR DME, well, guess what? You're probably going to need DME, okay? Now, again, going back to that advisory circular that I talked about earlier, AC 90-108 again, can we substitute GPS for DME? And the answer is yes. Okay, so the GPS becomes our DME, it becomes distance measuring equipment.
Let's be real clear, though, if I could, to interrupt you, because I'm sitting here thinking, as a student pilot or a young pilot, somebody that doesn't have even 100 hours, does that mean the GPS that I'm getting, the GPS signal that I'm getting from my Stratus or my Stratix into ForeFlight that says I've programmed direct to, it says 10 miles from it, is that DME?
It's technically not DME. It is distance, but is not what we would call traditional DME. Now,
can I use that to shoot an approach?
Yes, you can. Yes,
legally,
you can.
that
yes.
DME only on my iPad? That measuring equipment on my iPad?
No, not on your iPad.
Yeah, right.
No. It has to be installed in the airplane.
Okay, there you go.
Yeah, it has to be installed in the airplane. Now, the difference in this is not slant range, because if you have an intersection, that intersection starts on the ground and goes all the way up to infinity. So when you actually hit the intersection, you should be at zero if you fly exactly over the intersection. So again, now here's some deep trivia. One question I ask on check rides is what documents is required to be on board the airplane. And a lot of people will talk about a radio license, and they'll say, well, a radio license if you're going to fly international. And a lot of times I'll say, well, since you brought it up, tell me what radios need to be listed on the radio license. And this is an FCC requirement, and the answer is any radio that transmits. So typically in our airplanes we have VHF radios that we talk on. Okay, well that transmits. So if you have two of them, those two have to be listed on the radio license. Typically we have two more in an airplane. Transponder, that's a radio that transmits. Okay, that needs to be on the radio license. We usually, and we also have, if we had an airplane that had DME, the way DME works is it shoots the signal to the VOR, and then the signal comes back, and it measures the distance. It measures the time.
Which calculates the distance.
Yeah.
Right.
And so if we had an airplane with DME, that would need to also be on the radio license.
Wow. I don't think I knew all of those items, but I did think I know the transponder, but I don't think I would have known the DME.
Oh, and ELT. And ELT is also something that would need to be on the radio license as well.
Hopefully I don't ever activate that.
Yeah.
Even non-activated.
Anything that transmits. But that's just a little trivia. But that's the way the DME works. I mean, and you just think of that. I mean, this stuff is moving at the speed of light. It's moving really fast, but it calculates, and that's how it knows the distance.
So if an applicant or a student pilot were to, student meaning an instrument student, were to say that you, of course we have ADF because I shot this with my instructor a whole bunch of times, where do you think the problem lies with flight instruction? Are we teaching shortcuts? Are we shooting so many approaches back to back to back that we're not really able to dive into this? Is it the lack of mission-based training? What do you think causes someone to assume we have an ADF when we maybe don't have that equipment or don't know we have that equipment?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know what the answer is. I think people don't understand what an actual ADF is. I mean, if you Google it, you see all kinds of antiquated pictures of what an ADF actually looks like in the airplane. And, if you know that you can listen to an AM radio station on an ADF, I think if you just said, hey, do I have anything in the airplane that lets me listen to sports talk radio? 610?
Half the people listening don't even know what AM radio is, Wally.
Right. Well, that's true.
It's not Spotify.
That's true.
You're not going to find it on Spotify.
That's true. And when we go out on a check ride, we're doing 3 approaches. We're doing holding. We're doing unusual attitudes. We're cramming a lot of stuff in maybe a 2-hour flight or maybe even less than that. It's a little bit unrealistic. It is. I mean, before, if I'm flying an international flight, before I even leave the gate here in Houston, I have the approach that I'm expecting loaded for, where I'm going. And it may be 8 hours from now when I get there. I know if I'm going to Honolulu, it's going to be an ILS to runway 8 left. But now that the runway is closed for resurfacing, it's going to be ILS to runway 4, one of the 4s. In Honolulu. So we have that already loaded, and 90% of the time it is what we expected. I mean, there are times where things change en route, and you can always change the approach. But the bam, bam, bam way that we do check rides is a little bit unrealistic. It's harder. Things are happening a lot quicker, so maybe it's not. The answer is, I mean, do we now do a 6-hour instrument check ride? I don't think any of us want that.
No, but I think it's good for students to realize that, and I know I did, although I had a lot of real actual time. I think the simulation of these approaches maybe aren't really necessarily reality. We're learning all the fundamentals. We're learning how to fly safely. We're learning how to do all of the things we need to do to be able to be safe. But the reality also being that we need to make sure we're proficient in what we're doing, right? And if we read ADF required and we're not really sure, that might not be something that we want to do, right? Because of a lack of proficiency. What other, and maybe it's not bad behaviors, but are there other things that you recognize in instrument check rides, evaluations that make you think, hey, these are things that maybe people should be thinking about a little bit more?
Yeah, I think we all struggle to an extent with the 24-hour clock and UCT.
Yeah, I'll challenge everybody right now. Whenever you listen to the show, what is the UCT Zulu time wherever you're at right now? Do you know it? Can you say it right off the top of your head?
Right. Yeah. Probably not.
Probably
I
not.
mean, there's a lot of calculations. Is it +5? What is it? What is it? I one thing that I would say, I mean, first of all, I think a lot of us struggle with a 24-hour clock. I grew up with a father who, whenever he wrote a note and he gave a time, he put it in military time. And I always rolled my eyes a little bit, and I'm thinking, come on, Dad, World War II's over with. But
he was second-gen pilot.
Yeah.
Making sure his son was ready to be a pilot.
Yeah. So I got a dosage of it and just had to learn how to deal with it. And then I jump in aviation and realize that's the universal language, a 24-hour clock. And what I would suggest to most people, have a digital watch. And most people, a lot of you are going to have Apple Watches. You have the ability to display your time on a 24-hour clock. Just flip the switch and bite the bullet and start looking at it. And, after a while, you'll realize that 1400 is 2 o'clock and 2000 is 8 o'clock at night, and you'll get used to it. At my airline job, I mean, we're a worldwide airline. We operate 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. So anytime we're talking at work, I mean, everything is on a 24-hour clock. I mean, when you're scheduling calls, you just say, hey, we need you for a trip. It's got a 1930 show time for a 2100 go time or whatever. It's a 24-hour clock. So I think we can start with that, is acclimating ourselves to the 24-hour clock. And then, knowing what your conversion is wherever you happen to live. I mean, we here in the central time zone, this time of year, it's +6. And on my watch, I have a separate little thing that has universal coordinated time, but I also can just do the math and add 6, and it's not too terribly hard to do that. The only time that you have to worry about going over the 24-hour time is in the middle of the night, and I'm usually sleeping, so it's usually not a big problem. Because, a lot of times I will, on a check ride, I will ask the applicant, say your estimate for such and such an intersection. And now, depending on their airplane, there's probably a way to display that in their GPS unit, and it may already be displayed. But even if it's not, I mean, they can look over and they can say, hey, we're 11 minutes away from wherever we are. And what time is it now? It's let's say it's noon. That's 1200. That's 1800 UCT. 1800 plus 11. My estimate is 1811.
Yeah, I don't think, if I was asked my estimate, I would probably default to 11 minutes if I was telling the answer to that question to a controller. But I can see the value and the reasoning for being able to give it in military time and or giving it in UTC time for sure. I think it's important, a lot of times we copy down weather. weather's always given at the Zulu time that it was given. You kind of need to know if that weather's somewhat frequent.
Yeah. Is it 2 minutes old or is it 62 minutes old? Yeah.
Or am I listening to a recording from yesterday that might be completely inaccurate?
Right.
You definitely need to be able to know those times and be able to calculate those times.
Yeah.
Well, I think it was a good hodgepodge of leftovers for the holidays as it relates to instrument training and instrument check rides and some of the things that Wally recognizes as he's evaluating people and just really flying and seeing how we're doing in the real world. I would challenge everybody, this is the time of year. If you're an instrument pilot and you're not proficient, you might be current, but you might not be proficient, go jump in a plane with a flight instructor somewhere, anywhere in the world, get some actual time with them, shoot those approaches, make sure you know the icing levels. It's for us that live in the heat, we don't think about ice very often, but this is the time of year where this morning probably it was 3,000 or 4,000 feet, right? And you definitely want to be careful if you're flying in an aluminum airplane and it's icing at 3,000 or 4,000 feet. So make sure you keep your head on a swivel, make sure you're proficient, and as always, fly safely and stay behind the prop.
Thanks for checking out the Behind the Prop podcast. Be sure to click subscribe and check us out online at BehindTheProp.com. Behind the Prop is recorded in Houston, Texas. Creator and host is Bobby Doss. Co-host is Wally Mulhern. The show is for entertainment purposes only and is not meant to replace actual flight instruction. Thanks for listening, and remember, fly safe.